Just 4 days after Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a fierce fire tore through Tara Baker's home on Fawn Drive. When firefighters finally battled the flames into silence, they stumbled upon something no one expected: a lifeless body among the ashes. But what happened next only deepened the heartbreak. Instead of calling Tara's mother, who lived right there in the same city, police contacted Tara's boyfriend from out of town to make the identification. And for Virginia Baker, the suffering didn't stop there. She waited more than 10 long years just to receive her daughter's death certificate, nearly 20 years before she was allowed to read the autopsy report. Meanwhile, the man responsible lived comfortably just 1 block away, untouched, unnoticed, for 23 years. Was this an act of negligence, or was it something even more sinister? To this day, the questions hang in the air, heavy, unanswered. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell on so that you don't miss any of our latest stories. Late summer sunshine lazed through the office window, painting Sheriff Jerry Salter's room with soft, dusty streaks. The air was thick, quiet, except for the soft, tired whir of an old ceiling fan, like it kept time with the years waiting. Salter sat staring at an email from the Western Circuit District Attorney's office, his face lined by too many sleepless nights and too many cold cups of coffee. Bold letters jumped from the screen. Defendant Edric Lamont Faust pleads not guilty to all counts. A heavy sigh escaped him. It wasn't surprising, but it still hit hard. Faust had lived unnoticed in the community for more than 2 decades, blending in with a calm, ordinary demeanor. And now, here he was, claiming innocence. Salter recalled that unnerving calmness on the day of the arrest, the kind of expression that made your skin crawl, with the feeling he had expected this moment all along. Then came more bad news. The trial date was being pushed back, again. With over 25,000 pages of files, the court needed more time. The new tentative date, late 2025. Even with an arrest finally made, Tara Baker's case remained the deepest wound of Salter's career, a burden he'd carried since he was a young detective. And through all those years, one person never let the flame die: Tara's mother, Virginia. Her persistence, calling first weekly and then monthly, never giving up, had kept the ember alive. Her belief fed his own. As Salter scanned the first lines of the latest report, memories flooded back: Tara, her family, and the Athens community in the early 2000s. Tara Baker was born on January 20th, 1977, in East Point, Georgia, the oldest of 4 kids. Even as a little girl, her passion for the law shone through. While other children played with dolls, Tara ran mock trials with her stuffed animals. She wrote pretend legal contracts for relatives. She even mailed letters to the President of the United States if a speech interrupted her favorite TV show. You have to admire that level of commitment. Most kids would have just pouted. It is those small moments that outline the picture of a bright, determined child with big dreams. That drive carried her forward. After high school, she attended Georgia College, finishing 2 bachelor's degrees in just 3 years, a sign of her discipline and talent. In 1999, Tara was accepted into the University of Georgia, one of the top law schools in the country. The school was located in the quiet, charming town of Athens, a few hours from home. She didn't want to live in a dorm anymore, so she rented a house that had been divided into 3 separate apartments. Both of her roommates were also students, and she knew one of them already. To pay her bills and get real-world experience, she took a part-time job at a respected law firm in downtown Athens. Tara threw herself into her studies and job, focused and determined, walking steadily toward a bright and promising future. By January 2001, Tara was already 23 and well into her 2nd year of law school. At this time in her life, the university library was pretty much her second home. The night of January 18th was no different. She headed there with a friend and settled in for another long study session. Her friend left around 7:30 p.m., but Tara, always the dedicated one, decided to stay a bit longer. At 9:46 p.m., Tara called that same friend from inside the library, wanting to make sure she'd made it home safely. She mentioned she'd be leaving in a few minutes. No one realized those simple, thoughtful words would be the last anyone would ever hear from her, closing the door on a life filled with potential. The winter sun was fading outside the window of Virginia Baker's little bookstore on the afternoon of January 19th, about 6 p.m. She was getting ready to close up for the night when the phone rang. The number on the caller ID wasn't familiar. She hesitated but answered anyway. Mrs. Virginia Baker? The voice was steady, almost too steady. This is Detective Jerry Salters with the Athens Clark County Police Department. We need some information about your daughter, Tara Louise Baker. Has she ever been arrested before? Arrested? Tara? The question did not even make sense. For a moment, Virginia thought it might be some kind of scam or a really bad joke. She hung up, disturbed. But something inside her, the mother's instinct, told her to check. So she dialed the police department directly. To her surprise, the dispatcher verified that, in fact, there was a Detective Salters. Then, the bombshell dropped. There had been a fire at Tara's apartment early that morning. Virginia's heart seized. What happened? Is she all right? She inquired, grasping for the smallest ray of hope. We haven't found her, the dispatcher replied, and an unidentified body was discovered inside. That's why we need Tara's fingerprints. One roommate wasn't home, and we can't find the other, or Tara. The body could be one of them. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She tried to stay steady, asking in which room the body had been found. The answer struck her like lightning. The room was full of antique items. Virginia froze. She didn't need to hear another word. Tara adored antiques, collected them for years. She knew right then, deep in her bones, what the truth likely was. Still, the family raced to Athens. Every mile felt heavier than the one before it. The trees and storefronts, the unfamiliar faces passed by, but none of it was real anymore. Virginia felt as if she had stepped outside of the world she once understood. She prayed, she bargained, she begged the universe to be wrong. The morgue at the Athens Clark County Police Department was cold and quiet, acrid with the stench of disinfectant. The silence was thick, cut only by faraway footsteps and murmurs. Detective Salters, looking like the world weighed him down, ushered Virginia down a corridor to a small room. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed on, unemotional and stark. Lying on a metal table with a white sheet drawn up was a still figure. This is Tara Louise Baker, Mrs. Baker, Salters said softly, his voice wavering. Slowly, Virginia stepped forward. Every inch felt like lifting a mountain. And then she looked, really looked, and her world crumbled. Even though the fire had taken so much from Tara's face, a mother's eyes know what they love. The chestnut hair she'd brushed since childhood, the faint scar above Tara's right eyebrow from her bike riding tumble, the delicate necklace she'd given her for her 18th birthday. They were all still there. A scream ripped from Virginia's body, raw and primal and devastating, filled the room, echoing off its cold walls. Her legs gave out as the truth finally crushed her. She fell, shaking uncontrollably, sobbing with a grief that no parent ever imagines surviving. Her tears just didn't stop, just heavy, endless, heartbreaking. Tears flowed from her eyes, mingling with choked sobs as she reached out to touch her daughter's cold face. She desperately wanted this to be just a terrible dream. To hold Tara once more, feel her warmth, hear her laughter, anything that spoke volumes of the life she had raised and loved. But all that remained was coldness, and an emptiness that swallowed her whole. Tara's death didn't just end a promising life, it tore her mother's heart apart. Detective Jerry Salters stood nearby, helpless. Throughout his career, he had seen more tragedy than he cared to remember. But nothing cut quite as deeply as watching a mother lose her child, especially to such a brutal fate. The grief in that room clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake, and in that moment, he silently vowed to himself that he would not rest until justice was found for Tara Baker, no matter how long it took. The investigation was instituted, immediately with urgency and determination. Still, from the beginning, it had been intertwined with mysteries that made little sense. Detectives from the Athens Clark County Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation worked around the clock. They questioned every neighbor, every student in the area, every person who might have seen or heard anything. They spent hours interviewing Tara's friends, including one who had spoken to her the night she disappeared. That friend would later recall having spoken to Tara at 9:46 p.m. on January 18th. She remembered teasing Tara for studying so much, calling her a bookworm. Tara had laughed, saying she was packing up and would be home soon to relax. Just normal, everyday conversation. Nothing strange, nothing fearful. And those small, warm moments, lighthearted and ordinary, became the final memory she had of her best friend. Meanwhile, investigators started collecting chilling evidence at the scene. The police found semen and male DNA on Tara's body. There was blood on her body that didn't belong to the victim, and injuries pointed to her being attacked by a sharp weapon, likely a knife. Several hair and fiber samples were carefully collected. Everything put together pointed to one chilling fact. Tara had been raped and brutally murdered. The fire was set afterwards, probably to destroy the evidence. But there was one detail that made this crime scene even more puzzling. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The front and back doors were locked from the inside, almost as if Tara had locked them herself, or the killer had somehow done so before slipping away unseen. How does one break in, commit murder, set a fire, and leave without leaving obvious traces? Investigators were baffled. A witness came forward to report something strange. A middle-aged white man running down the street that morning in just a t-shirt and jeans, odd attire for the cold January weather. Police followed up on a tip about a suspicious call to the university days earlier. Someone who sounded intoxicated had asked for Tara's personal phone number. The caller was never identified. Next, detectives looked at a fellow student in Tara's class, someone with a reputation for making women uncomfortable. Several female students had complained about him. He frequently asked girls out and didn't always take no for an answer. He had asked Tara out several times, even though she clearly had a boyfriend. A disturbing pattern, but investigators found nothing that tied him directly to the murder. Then, there was the lawyer who worked at the same firm as Tara. Colleagues said the man acted strangely in the lead-up to Tara's death, suddenly withdrawing from the circle of friends that he'd always been a part of. What's more, just days before the murder, he called Tara to say that he wouldn't be able to make it to her birthday celebration, which was set for the day after she died. Meanwhile, early on the morning of January 19th, just prior to the discovery of the fire, a coworker sought him out to try and dissuade him from his decision to skip the festivities. His office was found empty, despite the workday having already started by then. He never arrived that day. Then the next day, he showed up at another colleague's house, acting strangely erratic behavior that made some people suspect he was under the influence of something. And the colleagues spotted something else, fresh scratches across his neck. That was enough to raise eyebrows, enough to make investigators take a closer look. Police quickly added the lawyer to their list of suspects. The medical examiner had already told them that skin cells, belonging to the attacker, were found under Tara's fingernails. That meant Tara likely fought back and scratched whoever attacked her. So detectives brought the lawyer in for questioning. He said the scratches on his neck came from a cat. He had nothing to do with Tara's murder, he said. But as investigators asked him if he had any idea who might have done it, his behavior took a strange turn. He blurted out that it was her father, but offered no explanation at all. It was one of those outbursts that didn't make much sense and raised even more questions. The biological samples were collected by the police, and he was given a polygraph test. But the results were inconclusive. Nothing strong enough to point to guilt or clear him. A few months later, the attorney abruptly resigned his position and left the state. Investigators found out later that he was secretly having a relationship with two female colleagues of the firm, despite his marital status. That could explain the erratic behavior and sudden disappearance from work. Both women also claimed they believed he was using illegal drugs at the time. Even so, nothing was found by police that connected him to Tara's murder. Eventually, they ruled him out. Detective Salters continued to follow every conceivable lead. He reviewed names from Tara's circle, checked out people with violent histories, and even looked at individuals connected to other crimes in Athens and nearby areas. Some voluntarily gave DNA samples, which investigators compared to what they found at the scene. But DNA analysis back in 2001 was hardly as advanced then as it is today. The technology struggled with small or damaged samples, and the DNA they did have didn't match anyone in Georgia's limited criminal database. Every lead fell apart. Every clue dried up. The case slowly slipped into cold case territory, something that haunted Salters. He was a firm believer in evidence, in science, but here everything felt like meaningless fragments that refused to fit together. From the moment Tara died, Virginia Baker's world dimmed. Her life turned into a fog of grief and determination. She didn't smile anymore. She barely slept. The bookstore she ran fell into neglect. Her days were consumed with one purpose: getting justice for her daughter. She became a steady, familiar presence at the Athens-Clarke County Police Department. She called Detective Salters again and again. First every week, then every 2 weeks, then every month, for 5 years straight. Each call carried a small spark of hope. Every call ended the same way. Any news, detective? Any leads? And though she expected the silence, she couldn't stop asking. One thing she had wanted most was access to Tara's autopsy report. She needed to know exactly what her daughter had been put through, down to even the most minute, painful details. Every time she asked, however, detectives gave the same response. They couldn't release it. To share it would compromise the investigation and release sensitive forensic information. She felt like another door slammed shut, another truth withheld, another piece of her daughter she wasn't allowed to have. But she refused to give up. She joined cold case support groups all over Georgia, drawing strength from families living the same nightmare. She learned how they fought to keep their loved ones' stories alive. On every year since Tara's death, Virginia had held memorials and candlelight vigils in Central Park and downtown Athens. Several dozen friends, neighbors, and residents came out to remember Tara. And every year, Virginia told her daughter's story again, her voice sometimes cracking, but her determination unwavering. As the years went by, her social circle gradually shrunk. Friends and relatives stopped knowing how to comfort her. Every conversation on any topic somehow always veered back to Tara, to the questions with no answers, to the justice never found. Her grief was too heavy, too consuming, and people didn't know how to respond. Virginia felt herself becoming isolated, but she didn't care. In her mind, her loneliness was nothing compared to the loneliness Tara must have felt in those final moments, facing her killer alone in her home, terrified and without help. Indeed, that thought was the fire that kept her going. Virginia had become so desperate for answers that she eventually turned to those paths that she once would have never considered. She called psychics who promised visions, dreams where they could see Tara, or even glimpse the face of her killer. Each reading required money for the hope that was thin and fleeting. She even hired a few private investigators, people who talked big but delivered nothing. Every tip went nowhere, leaving her more drained emotionally and financially. During all this, one of Tara's closest friends remained in contact with Virginia. At first, she was a wonderful source of comfort, standing beside Virginia at memorials and anniversaries. But as the years went by and Virginia's grief turned into an all-consuming mission, the friend slowly stepped back. She was torn awkward about the intensity of Virginia's obsession and weighed down by her own quiet guilt. Had she missed something in her last conversation with Tara? Could she have stopped any of this? Even as she tried to move on with life, every time she saw Tara's picture or read about cold cases, the hurt returned like a bruise that never quite healed. Though the public moved on, the case of Tara remained a scar on the memory of Athens. Those neighbors who never gave much thought to safety started double-checking their doors, adding alarm systems, and installing camera lights. The murder of Tara wasn't just another crime. It was a whispered story from porch to porch, a late-night reminder that even in peaceful towns, there can be dark corners. By 2020, a few true crime aficionados in Athens decided to do something different. They weren't detectives or journalists, just regular people who couldn't get the unsolved cases of the city off their minds. From that passion, a podcast called Classic City Crime was born. Of the many cases they covered, Tara's quickly stood out in particular. The weird crime scene, Virginia's tireless fight for answers, and decades of near silence from authorities comprised a mystery almost too haunting to ignore. The host and creator of the podcast, Cameron J. Harrelson, contacted Virginia. In a warm voice, his patient and genuine manner was different from those who had used her pain for personal gain. Even so, Virginia was careful. She'd been disappointed one time too many. But the sincerity in Cameron's voice slowly broke her defenses, and she began to open up about not just the facts, but the heartbreak she'd carried for nearly 20 years. When the first episodes dropped in early 2020, they hit a nerve. Virginia's raw, emotional interviews, paired with Cameron's careful research, pulled listeners in. In an instant, the Athens community woke up. The case they thought had faded into history was once again front and center. Online discussions exploded. Local news stations covered the podcast. People began pressuring officials to know what happened, writing letters, sending emails, and demanding answers. Even local politicians felt the heat. By the middle of 2020, the Athens Clarke County Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had no choice but to revisit their stance on releasing case information to families. In nearly 2 decades, Virginia finally had a breakthrough. One sweltering July afternoon, Detective Jerry Salters called her. His voice was serious in a way she had never heard. "Mrs. Baker, we've reviewed your request. We'll be releasing Tara's autopsy report to you." 19 years since losing her daughter, Virginia held the document in her hands for the very first time. It was clinical, cold, and full of painful medical detail, but it was the truth she had begged for. That night, she sat alone in Tara's bedroom, under the dim glow of a small lamp. Each line she read seemed to feel like a blade, turning slowly in her heart. The report confirmed what she had long feared. Tara had been. The report confirmed Virginia's worst fears. Tara had been sexually assaulted, brutally violated, and then murdered. The fire that followed was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence and hide the crime. The grief Virginia had carried for years, which she thought had dulled with time, surged back with a sharp, painful clarity. At last, she knew the truth, no matter how horrifying it was. Holding the autopsy report spurred something much larger. It wasn't just personal closure. It was proof to the community that Virginia and the Classic City Crime Podcast had been right all along. It was a revelation that would spark a movement. She was no longer in the fight alone. She connected with other families across Georgia who'd experienced similar tragedies and stagnation, forming alliances with those who understood her grief and frustration. Collectively, the families now lobbied state legislators. Sharing stories of their loved ones, they underscored the need for a dedicated system to resolve cold cases. Their message was simple but powerful. Justice doesn't have an expiration date, and modern technology could breathe new life into cases once thought hopeless. In 2022, Detective Jerry Salters was promoted to sheriff. Even in this higher position, Tara's case remained a heavy shadow over his career. On quiet nights, he would return to his office, reviewing her file under the warm glow of his desk lamp. The smell of smoke, the locked doors, the tiny inconsistencies that haunted the scene, all of them lingered in his memory. He kept a small locked box in his drawer. Photos of Tara alive, a ribbon from her hair, pieces of evidence he had never sent to cold storage. These were personal reminders, a weight of responsibility he could never put down. After years of tireless advocacy, the persistence of grieving families finally paid off. In 2023, the Coleman-Baker Act was signed into law in Georgia, named in honor of Tara and another victim. It was a historic turning point, establishing for the first time a dedicated cold case unit within the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, with its own budget and composed of a team of specialists. Their mission was to review and investigate unsolved murder cases using modern forensic tools, including advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. The act also stipulated that cold cases had to be reviewed at least every 3 years, with regular updates provided to the families of victims. For Virginia Baker, this was more than a legal victory. It was a ray of hope after 2 decades of darkness. She knew that finally her daughter's case, like so many others, had a chance at justice. Predictably, Tara's case was one of the very first files that the new cold case unit took on. By the end of 2023, with the Coleman-Baker Act well into implementation, the unit was up and running. A wave of renewed energy swept through the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. New staffers, new equipment, and a line-item budget pledged to attack cases that for decades had gone cold. It was over 2 decades since Tara Baker's file had become an open wound in the heart of Athens. Her file was dug out from the archives, carefully pulled. Sheriff Salters, who had carried this weight for so long, oversaw the transfer personally. He handed the reinvestigation over to a team of young, talented detectives in the cold case unit. Known for their intelligence, scrupulous data analysis, and staunch belief in forensic science, these detectives approached the case not just as an investigation, but as a mission to restore justice. Next to them were the leading DNA experts, innovators in genetic identification technologies. They buckled down to work with compulsive attention to detail, knowing this was not just a case file, but a family's hope, a community's wound, and finally a chance to bring peace to a story that had lingered in darkness for too long. The whole community held its breath as the cold case unit zeroed in on the biological evidence collected from Tara's crime scene back in 2001. For 23 years, these samples, carefully sealed in opaque evidence bags, sat silently in storage. Traces of semen, male DNA, unidentified blood, strange hair, and fibers. They were storytellers waiting for someone to finally listen. Now, with the use of modern technology, someone could. DNA specialists used techniques that detectives in 2001 could only have dreamed of. Next-generation sequencing, forensic genetic genealogy, and other advanced analysis allowed them to recover information from samples that had degraded over 2 decades. This job was painstaking. A slow, methodical struggle against the clock, where every DNA molecule was carefully extracted and looked at. Then, on an afternoon in March 2024, a detective's phone rang. On the other end was a scientist, her voice trembling with excitement. "We have a match! The DNA from the scene. It matches a subject in CODIS." His heart was racing. The detectives. After 23 years, after endless sleepless nights, after decades of waiting for justice. Finally, there was a name. Edric Lamont Faust, 48, Athens resident Faust. A name that seemed almost too ordinary. But the implications were staggering. He had lived just a few streets away from Tara. The DNA result was irrefutable. Justice, so long buried beneath the dust of time, was about to awaken. With Sheriff Salters now thoroughly rejuvenated, detectives launched an intensive investigation. They re-examined Faust's entire history of a criminal record filled with acts of violence and sexual assault, scattered across multiple counties, but now compiled into a terrifying portrait of a hidden predator. They circled back to a vague memory given by an elderly neighbor in 2001. The recollection was hazy, yet it was there. A black man loitering around Tara's apartment that night. Every detail was put together, no matter how minor. Records of Faust's employment were also scrutinized. At the time, he was employed with a local maintenance company, affording him easy, inconspicuous access to the apartment complex. The detectives also re-interviewed friends and acquaintances of Tara, some of whom remembered complaints about a strange man hanging around her building, warnings that went largely unheeded at the time. Piece by piece, the puzzle fell into place. From DNA to criminal history, from witness accounts to scene evidence, the chain of proof was now undeniable. It was strong enough to secure an arrest warrant. It was an early May morning in 2024, and without any pomp and circumstance, the police took Edric Lamont Faust into custody. He was arrested en route to work. Showing no resistance, no panic, and no surprise, his face was calm and eerily composed, as though he had been waiting for this day for the past 23 years. That unsettling composure, sent chills through everyone present. News of the arrest traveled like wildfire across Athens. A community that had long presumed Tara's murder would go unsolved was in a state of disbelief. Faust was not a stranger, not some petty thug, not someone from life's fringes. He was a neighbor, one who had silently fit in for upwards of 2 decades. He worked in maintenance near Tara's building, an unassuming job that masked the horrors he committed. It sent shockwaves through the town, where people felt that their security and sense of trust had been violated. Evil, it now seemed, had lived among them all along. On August 20th, 2024, Edric Lamont Faust's preliminary hearing was held at the Clark County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled. Virginia Baker sat in the front row with Tara's siblings, their faces reflections of grief, resolve, and quiet determination. Each of them knew that finally, after 23 long years, the journey for justice was entering its next chapter. But drama soon ensued, shocking many. Faust pleaded not guilty to all charges tied to Tara Baker's death: murder, aggravated assault, aggravated rape, arson, and concealing a body. He said nothing in court, his face eerily calm, as if untouched by the weight of his actions. The not guilty plea was a standard legal move, but it had the effect of making Tara's family relive the agony of his refusal to accept responsibility. Public reaction was swift and furious. After decades of pain, the Baker family was once again confronted with delay and denial, a cruel reminder that justice often takes time. The following trial was going to be just that: a relentless criminal prosecution. Every shred of evidence, every testimony by every witness would be picked apart in the cold, harsh light of the courtroom. With Faust maintaining his innocence, the cumulative, direct, and circumstantial evidence mounted an overwhelming case against him. Conviction and sentencing appeared to be more of a question of when than if. A soft click of the office door pulled Sheriff Jerry Salters from his thoughts. "Sheriff, another cup of coffee?" Sergeant Miller's soft voice brought him back to the present without really disrupting his train of thought. Salter shook his head, his gaze lingering on Tara Baker's file. Outside, the afternoon sun had deepened to a rich golden hue and cast a warm glow over the yellowed pages. He lifted his cold coffee cup and took a sip. The bitter taste lingered, fitting somehow, alongside the bitter news of Faust's obstinate plea. He scanned the final lines of the file: trial details, the refusal to plead guilty. Slowly, he closed the folder, set it aside, and exhaled a long, steady sigh. Relief, yes, but incomplete. A reminder that this fight, though far from over, had reached a pivotal moment. Tara's story was no longer a cold case. It was a beacon to families waiting for justice. Her life, her tragedy, reflected the power of faith, persistence, and community. Justice may be slow, but it never really expires. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to hit the bell to keep yourself updated with all new stories. Take care and live life with your loved ones.